Hello, everybody. I am joined today with someone who I'd offered an interview a while ago, and then I completely spaced it because it's me, and our lives got in the way, so we had to put that on the back burner. But I'm joined today with someone who I've spoken to for almost a year and a half to 2 years now. Uh, I wouldn't call him an enemy. I don't know him well enough to call him a friend. I'd just say an acquaintance. His name is Owen McDonald. If you would like to kind of just give yourself like an introduction, how would you describe you to the general audience?
Well, firstly, thank you for the introduction. I would call myself a left-wing person. Activist sounds a little bit too grandiose for me, but certainly someone who talks about social issues and politics and stuff. As far as my online presence goes, um, yeah, pretty basic, really. Um, I don't really see myself as like a big personality. I think I'm I guess just an analyst.
Yeah. Um, so you and I first met because of there was a comment on this woman's video, and I did not realize it was you until I looked back at it at the time. It was about feminism because that was the hot issue everyone wanted to beat to death in 2016. But I really got to kind of see what you were about on your first debate with War Corpse, and you actually mentioned me by name because of a chat comment I left. Um, so how did you even meet War Corpse? Because without him, we probably would not have crossed paths ever.
Good question. Um, as it happens, I'm quite a fan of the work of Lindsay Ellis. I'm not sure if you're aware of her. Um,
Slightly.
she used to play the Nostalgia Chick, but since she left Channel Awesome, she's done her own work, which is, in my opinion, a lot better. Um, but essentially, just like video essays and thought pieces. And on one occasion, I typed her name in onto the YouTube search bar, and was like scrolling through the results to sort of see what came up. And sure enough, there was a video by a guy essentially calling her a fake and a fraud and stuff. And out of curiosity, I just clicked on it, and it's War Corpse, and it's him essentially saying, "Oh, your career wouldn't be anything without Doug Walker," and all the usual, rubbish that is often thrown her way sometimes. And because it's War Corpse, and because he's quite a unique character on screen, I suppose you could say, um, I decided to watch a few more of them, and I ended up just watching, loads of his videos of him screaming at his camera, of these like ridiculous rants, which were, still quite amusing. I saw his cooking videos where he makes these like really unhealthy meals, all his like inane jokes, all that stuff, because it's quite unintentionally entertaining. And subsequently, I've commented under a few of them, and got a bit hooked and into commenting on a lot of them. And War Corpse took notice, and what he often does, or what he often did with people, is he'd say, "Do you want a debate? Challenge me, like let's settle this on a hangout or whatever." To anyone who would disagree with him on his thing, and because it's like a YouTube comment, and there's a bit of difference between going on a hangout with someone and just leaving a comment. Most people, aren't gonna follow up on him. But I thought, why not? Let's give it a go. And subsequently, he and I had a stream. So yeah, that's pretty much a condensed version of how I discovered War Corpse and my first forays into YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna lie. When I first found War Corpse, do you remember Kim Davis from 2015?
Um,
Or she was the woman in Kentucky that refused to give marriage licenses because of the Supreme Court declaring gay marriage illegal, right?
right, yeah, okay.
Yeah. So basically, I was looking at videos at the time, and I noticed his video, and the title was, of course, the most eloquent and mature thing out there. It was called, and I quote, "Kim Davis, do your job, bitch." So I just saw it as like, okay, I'm gonna be in for a treat. I'm watching it, and he actually sounded like a calm, articulate guy. Then I got about halfway through, and then he had one of those rants where he gets red faced, kind of like he did with you on the explaining to Owen McDonald what a moron he is, and he couldn't even spell your name right. Um, yeah, so and that was how I came across him, and I remember you would speak about him, kind of like you go back a few years. he was more articulate, he was more pleasant, and as time
Mm.
went on, he became less of that and more confrontational. And I do get where you're coming from, because if someone leaves a comment disagreeing with me, I'm not going. My first response isn't going to be, "Let's settle this in a hangout." I mean, if it goes on for more than a day, like if it's that if it's that contentious, then I would say, "All right," because I'm kind of lazy and I don't like to type all that often. It's like if they want to do so, I'll just give them the offer, but it's going to be worded much better than him, and I don't even have to use spell check. I'll say, "Hey, we've been arguing about this for quite a while via text. Would you like to appear on a stream with me? The choice is ultimately yours, and there's no hard feelings if you decline." Only once did someone take me up on the offer. Other times they wouldn't respond, or they'd say thanks but no thanks. And I think that in general, I've listened to you speak, or I've read you talking about how no one isn't you're not entitled to someone's time for a debate, and I've always found that to be like something I strongly agree with. So when people are like, I'll give you $10,000 to your campaign if you debate me. I think that I'm not gonna give someone money to debate me. I always thought that was kind of just strange, you know. Um, so when me and Owen first spoke to one another, everyone, it was to debate feminism, and I don't know. It's just generally, when people in War Corpse's comment section would act like you're this monster and whatnot, and they would be really mean to you. So I was like, okay, I kind of want to talk to this guy. This will be interesting because I don't think you're this evil monster that people portray you to be. So when we had our first stream, I'll admit I was rather nervous and a little anxious because I wasn't sure what to expect from you because I had never spoken to you before in person. Well, you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
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 Yes. So it's like, and sure, it did kind of get off the rails. It was more like, it was a little less organized than it probably should have been, but it was still generally fun. And I left that hangout thinking, yeah, these guys, they're a little too harsh on you. I mean, it's like, it's like, yeah, we've had our share of disagreements. I will admit, yeah, I've not always been the most respectful with them, but I mean, the rough edges have been smoothed over or have been sorted out. So I guess it could be some good news or bad news or whatever you want to take it to you, Owen, about those rough edges being smoothed over. But
I mean, sorry to
go
cut you
ahead.
off. I think with a lot of people, what they say and what they type can be very different. Often because people don't have to be in a conversation where they're directly speaking to someone, even if it's just over an audio, communication line. They can be much more vitriolic and far more aggressive. Hence, the sort of comments you would see under War Corpse's videos at me, where they'd be pretty, aggressive and stuff, and they probably wouldn't say that in real life, but because they're sort of an anonymous person just with an avatar on the internet, they can sort of say what they like. And I feel lots of people, if you have a conversation like this, are a lot calmer and nicer. And obviously, there's a few exceptions to that. As I'm sure we've both spoken to people who can't contain themselves on these kind of hangouts.
Yeah.
But for the most part, when you speak to people directly, they can be far easier to talk to. Regarding what was I going to say with War Corpse, you mentioned that I had said that he was formerly calmer, and I think that's true to a degree. Before, I looked at his channel, and you can see before he switched channels that there are like 3,000 videos or something. And I was thinking, that's loads. How can you, how can you have just years and years of this stuff? Like, you can watch 5 of his videos, and they're all essentially like encapsulate what he's about.
Yeah.
Then you go back to the start, and he's sort of talking in a much calmer way. He seems happier. He seems less, rage filled and consumed by blind hatred towards things he doesn't really seem to fully grasp. And it's it's kind of revealing in a way, because you look at him now and you look at him back then, and there's a change.
Yeah. It was actually, I actually remember because I used to binge watch his older videos, considering the fact, yeah, you could definitely notice a huge change. I mean, obviously, time is going to change a person. I mean, he started making videos in 2008. I would have been turning 7 years old at the time. So obviously, there's been huge changes in everyone's lives. Um, his first video, or at least the oldest one I could find on the channel before it was deleted, yeah, much calmer. The audio and the video quality were way worse, but I mean, over time, the quality in terms of audio and visuals would improve. But yeah, he would get much angrier and whatnot, and it's like with me, I used to be kind of like it'd be a mix of getting angry and thinking this is kind of funny how I'm angry, so I would kind of poke fun at myself for it. And over time, it's like, yeah, I don't really find interest in that type of character or mannerisms. But in his case, it's like it's a weird thing. I look at him now, and it's like I feel like he's toned it down. I think maybe he realized maybe this got me in trouble and got my channel deleted, so I should tone it down a bit, especially because I don't know about you, but when 2017 began, I started to notice a bit of a change in his character. He'd start to get even more vitriolic among things like that. And I think that maybe that was the cause of his channel deletion, and he realized, oh, the rules are enforced. Yeah, and when it comes to speaking to someone in person, you know, Owen has seen me get very vitriolic via text. I rarely get vitriolic during streams. The only stream I can recall getting really vitriolic on was with Voltaire, and I mean, it's Voltaire. The only debate or discussion I've ever been in where the person was vitriolic with me was in the past. It was Cult of Ham and then Humane Mind's brother, who I'm not even going to get started there. But
Humane has a brother.
Yes, he does.
But that was fun.
Yeah, especially when the dude was drunk during the stream and he's all screaming about the what do they call it? They get so obsessed with it. The nuclear family. Something about the nuclear family. And whenever I hear that term, I cannot help but feel some physical pain. But yeah, I've noticed with you, because I remember when people used to spam your Curious Cat with all these weird questions, I would sort through the ones where it's like obviously stupid questions, where it's like they're trolling you, and then I'd get to the ones where they're like kind of serious questions, like, how'd you get into politics? I don't remember how you said on there you got into politics, but wasn't it something like you were raised in a progressive family?
Yeah, I can elaborate now if you want.
Yeah, sure.
I think because I've been brought up in a family where it's, my mum was very left wing from a mining family. Her parents came over from the West Indies as part of the essentially like a rebuilding Britain project, because after the war, Britain obviously wasn't in the best shape. So they invited people from all around their former colonies to come over to the UK to help rebuild its infrastructure and boost the economy again. And because of that, in fact, the heritage of my family has been rooted in a quite working class background, where my grandparents were working in the mines, quite literally. So because of that, my family has been quite left wing, quite taught to be nice. I'm trying to phrase it properly. It's always been a caring family. It's about looking after people, being nice to others. If you're good to people, people will be good to you. Being a good person and stuff. Being conscious of your surroundings and other people. Being selfless and stuff. And subsequently, that sort of put me on a leftward trajectory from the start. And as I get older, as I'm more aware of the world around me, as I go through time with more education and a bit more maturity and stuff, my views begin to solidify. I start to go further and further left. And before I reached university, I was already considering myself quite far left. I just didn't really have the words for it. I would just say, "Oh, I'm far left," which that isn't really. That's not a concrete position, really. It's not until I joined for the Freshers Week in university. There's loads of societies that are on offer. You can join up, go along with loads of stuff. And one of the political ones I went to was Marxist Society, and that's essentially where my socialist ideas and ideals came from. Being in that sort of environment, eventually getting to read Marx, listening to speakers who come from around the country, because I was in Manchester, so obviously a pretty big place. So people would come there and give talks about socialism and capitalism and stuff, and that's where I suppose my anti-capitalism, my socialism, really began.
Yeah, because that's rather interesting, honestly. My family's had similar upbringings of blue collar, and my grandfather he worked in a coal mine and joined the Navy to escape that. I don't remember entirely the history of my family, but that's actually rather similar to the background of my family, honestly. And it's interesting with you because it's because when we first spoke to one another, there was nothing we could really agree on, despite some social issues, like gay marriage, abortion, whatnot. But when I started to read your Twitter and look past the political posts and just kind of set politics aside, I started to see you less as just a political figure. Well, maybe not. Maybe a political figure is maybe that's not the right wording. Maybe just like you said, an analyst. I guess it was like, yeah, he is a person, and when you talk about what you're going through, and I started to be like, okay, and that's why I sent you the message being like, I despite our disagreements, I will always wish you well, even if I'm like seeing red because of an argument we're having. But yeah, I do like the philosophy of being nice to people. Like when we first met, like when I first heard of your name, I'm like, Owen versus War Corpse. I don't even know who this guy is, but I hope he can stomach having to deal with a drunk for however long you debate him. So yeah, and would you say that just calling yourself far left, would you say that is too vague, or that's just generally vague? Because it's also kind of a weird thing, because it's like, Hawk considers himself, well, at least center to moderate left, and it's like those type of terms are very, very I wouldn't try and say subjective, but very confusing and vague, as depending on the person you ask, that could mean several different things.
Exactly. I think you're absolutely right by saying it's subjective, because far left is more of an adjective than anything. It is used to describe things. And yeah, sure, if you have a broad political spectrum and you're encompassing every single faction of politics, then yeah, you could say, oh, I'm far left, and people would know that you mean socialist or anti-capitalist or whatever. However, sadly, we don't live in that world. We live in a world where politics have been diluted down to elements of the spectrum where choices aren't really that all-encompassing. So, for instance, if you say far left in America, some people might think you mean Bernie Sanders, who is at best a social democrat who advocates for things that already exist in Europe. In the same way that you could describe someone as fast without them necessarily being an Olympic sprinter, just saying someone is far left doesn't then make them an actual socialist or whatever. So, like you say, it's best to have more concrete terms a lot of the time, and they don't have to be like rigid, like, oh, you must meet all 10 of my checklist to meet these things. But
yeah,
at the same time, just I prefer to say, oh, I'm a socialist, or I'm an anti-capitalist, rather than just say I'm far left these days, because it gives more meaning to it. It allows people to know what I am.
Yeah, I think it's like, I know people like to say, I don't want to get labeled, but I think sometimes you're going to have to label yourself before people label you first. And that's an interesting point about political spectrums. As you notice in, for instance, the United States, my country, I get very annoyed, sometimes like really irritated with Republicans and conservatives and people being like these far left liberals and something like that, where they're just it's just a pejorative. It's like, I'm not far left. Owen is very aware of this. However, I'm not going to be this, I'm not going to act like some of these people who, maybe the term McCarthyist is correct because they're just calling all these things far left. it's like, yeah, politics is a spectrum, and I think people are getting fed up with being forced into like it's a spectrum and clearly not a binary. Um, Left and right, you could say it could be a binary, but as to where between left and right or center where you are could be, because you could just say you're left. You could say I'm left wing or right wing. That's even more vague, considering that it's like, okay, there's moderate, center, and far left, or same for the right. It's like you'd have to get more specific. Far left, that's still not specific enough. You saying socialist or anti-capitalist is very specific, um, but you'd probably still have to get more specific as to other things to the authoritarian, libertarian left and right. That's why I think, like, calling yourself far left, that's fine if you're trying to describe your views to me. But I'd probably just rather ask you various like type of political positions rather than just far left. I've heard you. Go ahead.
What I was going to say was, yeah, I mean, like you said, it's important to elaborate. So when I call myself a socialist, I like being able to talk about why that is and what makes me that. So like you say, it's important to be able to say why rather than just saying what, essentially.
Yeah.
Anyway, you go ahead.
Yeah, because I was going to ask a question, because this is something, I don't remember you saying anything about it, but it was just something where it's like, I wonder what because the word populist, it has a mixed reputation. Some use it as a pejorative, just like liberal and far left, and then there are people who cloudly call themselves a populist or just get called a populist, like Donald Trump, for instance. What is like your take on populism? Because it seems like sometimes some of your posts come off as populist, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Just to be, I'm not going to call you a populist and be like, he's such a populist. It's just going to be more like, yeah, he sounds like a populist leaning, I guess.
So I think with the term populist, it's got a little bit of stigma. All the word really means is, someone who goes for what is popular. Someone who attempts to align themselves with the views of the majority, essentially. However, this term is co-opted essentially to mean someone who is against the elite or someone who's for the people, whatever. And because it's thrown around so much, like you said, by or against the people using it, it sort of becomes a little bit vague and a bit worthless. Now, having said this, I think with populism, I wouldn't describe myself as a populist because it sort of defeats the point. Like, of course, everyone wants to have their ideas agreed with by the majority of people because that's the whole point. You want your ideas to reflect in the society you wish to achieve. I'm not gonna. I don't think there's anyone who's like, oh, I've got these ideas, but I don't want anyone else to share them, and I want my society to never happen. Like, no one thinks like that. Therefore, I find the term a little bit redundant because it should be the aim, and you think would be the aim of most political people. Mm-hmm. No one's going to run an election saying we don't care about your interests. We're here to make money. Like, no one's going to run an election like that.
Yeah.
So I find it a little bit redundant. Having said that, I think it can be used to describe people. Usually, it's best used to describe people that are trying to con their way into office by running on vague messages and non-specific policies designed to just win people over cheaply.
Yeah, that is something. It's like I read up about various elections because it's fascinating and it kind of tells the story of the history of the country. Like Thomas Dewey in 1948, he was trying to make sure he didn't say anything like silly, but he was being very vague and too careful with his campaign, and that's why he would lose. So it's like, there's politicians or people who are running for office where I might disagree with them, and I might not like them personally, but I will respect them if they speak in more universal terms. If they are plainly spoken, but I mean, I have a problem with those who are like, we need to elect more plainly spoken people, where I think that I'm not saying they're calling the general population dumb or anything, but I do think that people can kind of mostly grasp what you're saying. If you're I mean, you're plainly spoken. Yeah, I mean, your vocabulary is much stronger than people like, I don't know, War Corps, but it's pretty clear to see what you're saying. And I think people like that are better suited to run for office. And this was a question I've been meaning to ask you for a while, because I don't know where you stand on this, or if you have a stance on it at all. But when you did your very first response video to me, you mentioned that I was critical of the Electoral College at the time. What type of voting system do you like? Like ranked choice voting, direct popular vote, or Electoral College in terms of like types of voting systems?
So firstly, a very good question and a good memory to remember that far back to a response video I did, well, probably over a year ago by now. But no, I think in terms of voting system, it needs to be direct. It needs to be, no first past the post for one is an atrocious system. I actually did an essay on this a few years ago. No, does it not represent what people vote for? It is very easy to gerrymander. It's very easy to, skewer in favor of people who have existing power, and doesn't deliver results that reflect what people actually vote for. So my designed electoral system would have runoff voting, so you'd be able to vote for people in order of preference rather than just voting for one person and discarding everyone else. It would be proportional, so you actually have elections which reflect the way people have voted rather than just drawing up boundaries and deciding what people do. It also I would separate it out. So if you were, because ignoring the fact that I have different ideas to how a government, or what a government should be, if we're keeping this, the system of having a president and stuff at present, you'd have the elections for president and the elections, of local elections and stuff kept completely separate. So, for instance, in the UK, we elect our MPs, but then the party with the most MPs gets to have a prime minister, who is one of those MPs. It would be different if it was me, because a lot of people don't know who their local MP is. They don't know, or they're not aware of who is in their local council. They vote based on their who they want to run the country, and subsequently, the vote is sort of confused and muddled a little bit. So I'd have separate elections. I'd have what's it called? Proportional representation, runoff voting incorporated into that. We do away with the Electoral College because there's no need to have a group of people deciding where how to allocate votes and stuff. And essentially, it would be a system that is directly controlled by the people. And obviously, that comes with all the systemic stuff I'd change, which I'm sure, as indicated by my, being a socialist, you'd be well aware of. But, on the very least, the system has to be directly, represented by, the voters.
Yeah. I mean, because the reason I mentioned that is I remembered because it was something, because like the types of voting systems, this is something I've been thinking about and reading about a lot recently, and something clicked in my head that you and I had briefly touched up upon this in your response video to me nearly a year and a half ago, and I'm like, oh yeah, he did say that I was critical of the Electoral College. Now, a couple of months ago, I was a fan of the Electoral College, but as I looked at other voting systems, because I didn't know every single one of them, and I actually did a poll asking people about this, and I'm looking at your poll as to like what types of political outlets you should use. First, and I would just read up about these various things, because in my country, to get elected to public office, usually it is first past the post. There are certain offices which, if you have to get a majority of the vote, or the state Congress will choose. I don't remember which states, but there is several states where that is the case, which I tend not to really approve of that, in all honesty. So your poll, which you were asking about political outlets, because first past the post allows for a plurality of the vote to decide the fate of the country. Lapis's country, Canada, Justin Trudeau, his party won 39% of the national vote. and it was a very close election. And yeah, I don't really like first past the post. I think that's why people argue for the electoral college, is because of first past the post. Because your poll says 38% want Twitter posts, 35% voted for videos and streams, 22% voted for essays and blogs, and 5% said other. So it's a very close plurality. But yeah, I mean, as to what you described, your type of system, I don't entirely disagree with that type of voting system. Because what you sounded like you were describing ranked choice voting, which Hawk was going on and on and on about this. Which, if we do get rid of the electoral college, I actually would really not mind having a ranked choice voting be the case. But you know, people who follow either of us or have watched our debates understand we very much disagree on a lot of things. A few social issues, mainly economics, immigration, and whatnot. But I remember you were doing. Wait, what?
No, sorry, I just chortled, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, yeah, but there was one thing you were speaking about, which I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but I very much agreed with it, because you were doing this trend thing where it's like, you know, if you like this post, I like, for how many likes I get, I'll answer this many questions. You were doing that at the time, and there was something about romanticism and aromanticism and whatnot, and how you were describing it. You're like something about relationships. I'm trying to remember this to the best of my ability, but it was something about relationships and how, you know, your worth isn't defined by if you are with a person or single or whatnot. And you were describing your own personal situation, and you were describing various things about like romantic relationships and things like that. And I wholeheartedly agreed, even before I even knew that the term aromantic was a thing. You know, and I was very happy about that, just to see that. And yeah, I mean, we agree on things like abortion. We agree on things like the aromanticism and asexuality are legitimate and whatnot. When you were, because I think I asked this question and you said you were never against LGBT people, and that, you know, when you got to meet individuals of that group online and whatnot. And I think you even said real life to an extent. You know, you got learn more about it, and you became a firm ally or supporter of those causes, right?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, firstly, I tend not to call myself an ally or supporter, because I don't like, as I said earlier, I don't like the grandiose sort of nature of that. I don't like sort of saying, oh yeah, I'm an ally. I just thought, like, let my actions do that, and let, you know, LGBT people judge whether they want to, you know, trust me as someone to rely upon. You know, obviously I use my voice and stuff, but I've never really called myself an ally. And as far as a supporter, it's like, it's, yeah, obviously I want, you know, LGBT people to have the same rights and stuff, but it's a given, really. It's like not a big thing. It should be like, that should be the expected position, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But coming back to what you were saying, yeah, you're right. I've never really been like someone who's, you know, had to unlearn my opposition to LGBTQ people. You know, I've just sort of, it's been, you know, as soon as I'm aware of them, it's like, okay, you know, they're same as me, basically. Like I said, I grew up in a household that wasn't really, you know, thankfully subject to many of the bigotries I speak about. So I've never really been in a position where I've been like against gay people or whatever. And yeah, like I said, meeting LGBTQ people both in real life and on the internet, you know, it only reaffirms your, you know, position. And as someone who, you know, speaks out about injustice and discrimination and stuff quite a bit, it only becomes natural to me that my voice as a person, you know, who just is aware of this, is needed to speak out about it. Because, you know, if we all stand up and speak out against stuff, we can make a big difference. And it sounds cliched, but, you know, it only takes a few dissenting voices to stop someone's, you know, bigotry. You can do a lot of good by just speaking out and letting people know that their bigotry won't be tolerated. So yeah, no, I've certainly, as time's gone on, I've been more outspoken in my, you know, activism again, not wanting to use that word because it sounds a bit too, um,
Grandiose.
yeah, exactly, celebratory. But yeah, no, I've always sort of I've never really been against LGBTQ people. As long as I've been aware of them, I've always sort of seen them as normal.
Yeah, you see them as valuable and having the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as you, as I take it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's
Yeah,
no difference.
yeah. Um, yeah, I remember when I was telling you about how I first came across LGBT people. I was only 5, and I was having it explained to me, and of course, it was like the most vague, confusing, and even then, it was like I was rather indifferent because it's like I'm 5. I don't really understand what a trans woman is, but I also forgot to include the trans part. So whenever I would see that person, I never misgendered trans women as a little kid. If I saw a trans person, usually they would say to me, like usually, someone would tell me beforehand this person is a woman or a man or whatnot. Um, and I didn't know any different. And I honestly thought, I was very naive. I thought that trans women would be able to have children, like give birth and everything. And while I wish I would have been correct on that, um, I was just glad to reflect, because when you and I would fight about uh, other gender identities last year, it gave me the ability to reflect and think about when I first heard of people that were transgender and of other sexual orientations. It was kind of nice to reflect and being like, kind of looking back, and before I even touched the internet, just to look back. Um, but I kind of, you've mentioned this a few times already, and it's kind of actually really interesting. And I do get where you come from on not wanting to use certain terms to describe yourself. Like, for instance, I've gone to labor because my father works in a labor union. It's one of the biggest ones in the world, if I'm not mistaken. And every September we will go to, in March as well, we'll go to these parades and march at the state's capital, not in the Capitol building, but in the capital of the state. Uh,
Yeah.
I've never called myself an activist for the views I've held. I've gone to Pride to support my trans friends and of other sexual orientations and whatnot. I also think that the term, like, also when you mentioned that it should be just a given, you shouldn't be expected or given a cookie, to put it one way, for being in support of people that are LGBT and whatnot. I think that should be, like you said, just a given. Like, when I was having a hangout with Lapis, and I was telling her about you know that I've defended I defended a trans teacher of mine in middle school, and I was telling her this. I'm like, I just mentioned it. I was like, I kind of get annoyed when people just, because I will recount an experience if it's relevant, or if they're talking about a subject. So like if she was telling me about an instance of transphobia she saw in real life, I'd be like, yeah, I remember I've seen transphobia in real life, and I've dealt with it. But I'm not going to say it to be like, oh, I'm one of the good cis people. I'm just going to be like, yeah, I've had the similar experience of seeing it and having dealt with it. Um, if you don't mind me asking, have you ever seen acts of bigotry or whatever in public, like IRL? If that's not if that's an invasive question, then my apologies.
No, not at all. I've never seen. When you say bigotry, you mean towards LGBTQ people, right?
It could be them or really anyone in general, or even yourself.
Oh well, well, yeah, definitely. In terms of like bigotry, like yeah, I think everyone's. You have to be very fortunate to have not seen or experienced bigotry. Um, referring, as a black person, I think you're always gonna face racism at some point or other, and the longer you don't face that, the luckier you are, really, I guess. Um, but yeah, no, from a young age, I can remember people at the nursery I went to said my skin was like dirty and stuff.
Ew.
Um, I can, I've got all sorts of memories and tales of that sort of thing happening. Um, I think it, in many ways, helps me sort of, you know, understand why it's so important to speak out against stuff, because no one should be treated like that.
Mm.
And especially when it comes to trans people who, sadly face a lot of additional bigotry because of the fact that people aren't as familiar with trans people, and thus it's easier for bigots to normalize and coerce people into, bigotry. Um, Thus,
Yeah.
I'm such a vocal, I try and be a vocal, anti-trans person, I suppose you could say. Opposition to bigots and transphobes and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and like you said, we used to talk about trans people quite a bit, and you've hopefully changed some of your opinions and stuff
I can, yeah,
since.
I
Yeah,
could elaborate on that if you'd want me to like uh to give some clarifications, as it's been well over a year since the last time we publicly discussed it on YouTube and even on Twitter itself. But
but I mean, I think it's
yeah,
obvious that you changed your opinions on it, to be honest, because
yeah, I
um,
mean, it was a given with time. Obviously, like if you were to ask me certain questions, like if you were to interview me and you just asked various questions, I'm pretty sure you if you were to compare me now to then, there would be some major changes. But yeah, with what you were saying regarding um, with regarding things that happen in real life, yeah, I mean bigotry does. I do think it will affect you at some point in your life. Like I grew up rather poor, you know, and kids at school were very classist, which was ironic because they lived in the same neighborhood as me, would mock what job my mother had, and various things where it's like the hypocrisy was overwhelming. But I mean, to be fair, people my age at the time, being consistent is not their strong suit. But yeah, um, like you also said, if you could go, the longer you go without people being horrible to you, like the more fortunate you are. And an example of well, I think I can justify to myself calling it transphobic. Remember when Gemini was being invasive with questions with Lapis?
yeah, I
Yeah,
remember that.
I justify how I responded to that whole thing, considering it's like, I heard, I could hear her in the stream crying when I watched it back, and I'm like, if you can't tell that your questions are inappropriate and invasive, you can hear the person crying. I'm not going to just call them the R word or whatever. I'm just going to say you are being intentionally dense. Like, let's say I was asking you questions about, like, very invasive questions regarding your sexual orientation or mental health. And let's say you were to the point of tears because it's something that really is something that affects you. Or if you were to ask me those same type of questions, like, or some type of question where it's invasive and get someone to the point of tears, you know, you and I would be able to tell that, oh, we're asking some rather inappropriate questions here. Let's knock it off. And, you know,
Well, I think that's the thing. Lots of people, lots of cis people, don't take into account that trans people, are actual people in a way, and yeah, they're aware they exist, but they have they have no behavior, skills around them. They say and do awful things, often unwittingly, and often as a quote unquote joke, because they literally haven't been taught anything about trans people, and subsequently see them as freakish and unusual when obviously that's not the case. And obviously bigots take advantage of this because they are able to coerce the conversation and make it seem as though trans people are being the irrational ones, when in reality it's the transphobes being unfair and horrible towards trans people. And what what was I going to say? Uh, I've obviously come across many transphobes on my time, in the internet spheres, and I try obviously use my position as a cis person to speak out against that.
mm-hmm.
Um, and subsequently, I think it only reaffirms my, the ideas that bigotry has to always be, firmly stood up against. You can't ever let it just sit and fester because it only ends up hurting more people. And I think it's perhaps why with yourself in the past, if I could have just stopped speaking to you about people and trans ideas and all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, you're here now. You clearly had growth in character, and subsequently now, you quite vocally speak up for your trans friends and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, And I think that's what it's all about. I wouldn't be on here doing this if I didn't think I could. Yeah, I wasn't making an impact. And yeah, I'm not trying to say, oh yeah, I changed your mind, Deathman. I've made you who you are today. But at the same time, I feel as though pushing people in the right direction like is important. And
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, you have made some impacts on me. I would be remiss if I didn't point that out. Remember the punching Nazis debate, which even over a year later, I still feel rather bad for holding the position to begin with. But that was one area where you did change my mind, and there's other areas where it's like I might even still have the same opinion, but I've definitely I've let up with it. Like I don't have a hard line on it. I did say when I was making comments about sexuality, and I think we were arguing about asexuality. I do think that is legitimate. We were arguing about whether or not it is heterosexual to be with a trans woman. I think we were. Yeah, we most likely were. I don't remember, but that I do think you could be heterosexual and be with a trans woman, or if you're a cis woman, a trans man. Um, I think you definitely can be. I think that people like if they just go straight to the genitalia thing, it's like that lacks so much nuance. It's very obvious. It's redundant to say, you know. So like they're definitely. If I can speak proper English today, there are various areas where you and some people that you've associated with, like Lapis. It's like, spending time with different people. It's gonna have some impacts on you. I don't believe I've ever had an impact, in my time on here, discussing politics and whatnot. I don't think I've ever had an impact on somebody. Like that isn't really my goal on here. It's just to discuss politics and when and have just casual conversations. But generally, in the time I've spoken to you, like my image of you, my opinion of you has been a very interesting one. There are days where I'm like, I like Owen. He's all right. I think some people are they're a little too quick to judge him, other than his politics that I don't agree with. On a person to person level, I think he's a very nice guy. And then there are days where I'm like, Owen, please get out of my sight. Then there are days where I'm like, I'm indifferent. A few over the last few days, I've been rather indifferent because we haven't even talked to one another in the time being. But generally, it's like I always remind myself, even when I'm really angry with you, when we're discussing something and it gets heated, that you're doing what you believe is right, and you're just fighting for the things you believe will make the society better. And generally, it's like I don't think you hold these positions to be malicious or because you want to destroy the planet or whatever. I don't think that you have any ill intentions with these. And I don't know. Like, yeah, there's been people pointed out to me, Lapis a lot in particular. She points out to me that she's seen growth in me as a person, especially after that stream I did where I said I don't agree with the anti-social justice crowd. And I really like that stream where you and I were discussing that in general with Lonely Wolf, Chair, and JPM, although Chair unwittingly was reaffirming like the reason why I don't like the anti-SJW community. Like I would listen back to things you would say, and I would see these things like you'd mention empathy. At the time, I unironically said, screw empathy, because I was kind of being edgy, and I noticed you didn't like it, so it was kind of to spite you, really. But as time went on, and I'm like, yeah, no, you are right. These people lack empathy. And whenever I point it out, they get angry with me, which makes it both funny and reaffirms the point. But yeah, there's definitely you are right in saying there is growth in me as a person, and the reason I've defended my trans friends before we even met. Like I mentioned to you, my best friend. Like I consider this guy a brother to me. He came out to me as a trans guy. Never once had to say, hey. Could you please don't refer to my old name? Please, don't dead name me, and please use he/him pronouns. Never had to say that once. Like it just clicked with me. When that trans teacher I mentioned, when people would leave notes on her door saying "you look like a man," I'd rush to the room before she'd get there every day to take those off the door to hopefully give her a better start to the day rather than try not to cry because people are literally attacking the very being of your existence. And while there are times where I get really angry with people, and I will admit Calvin. I don't know if you know who that is, but I Google it was telling me about how you and her were talking about my interaction with Calvin, and I'll admit I was entirely in the wrong for what I was the insults I used at Calvin about calling the person a degenerate gender fuck. I fully regret that, and I still do. In hindsight, I felt really bad about saying that, considering the context of the situation and kind of the irony of the fact I had used it. But you know, it's with you. It's like there are various agreements I can have with you and disagreements. Um, I just think that politics, like it's always been vitriolic. It's never been civil. I just think people are finally starting to see it amplified. Because you talk about civility, and I think you have always said that politics has never been civil, or something along those lines. Am I wrong in saying that?
I think in regards to yeah, essentially that's what I said. In that, there's no you can dress things up as much as you want, and you can put a smile on things as much as you want, and have it as much as a nice chat around the table about politics. But at the end of the day, the political decisions that are made leads to catastrophe and consequences. So for instance, the same people who talk sort of civility on one hand enact policies which lead to people's benefits being taken away and them dying, lead to warfare and imperialism around the globe, and a whole host of other things. And thus, to talk of being civil to these people, because I think the thing that I was referring to at the time was a politician going into a restaurant and then being spoken to by other restaurant goers who were angry at that politician for I can't think it was healthcare related, and
I think I think she was actually a part of the Trump administration, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. If I'm not,
huh.
Yeah.
Oh, it was over ICE, wasn't it? And the
You're right.
Kids, and it's like you've ruined all these families. You're actively making people's lives worse, but we're supposed to be civil to you. It's like, well, no, that's not. No just society has that concept of civility. It's important to be civil to one another in things that require it. It's like if you're talking about your favorite film, you wouldn't expect someone to start screaming at you because you don't like X-Men or whatever. But when it's over, actual things that are literally causing lives to be ruined or even killed, it's who cares about being polite to the person responsible for that? You make some noise, make it uncomfortable for them, make it so that they have to change things, otherwise you'll change it for them.
There's another example I could use. There's similar grounds though. Because if you and I are just meeting to discuss politics, like we are right now, I'm not gonna get the mic really up close and start screaming at the top of my lungs at you and calling you all sorts of names, and you wouldn't do the same. There's no need to. There's no animosity here. Now, if I was a worker, who lived during the Great Depression, when Herbert Hoover was a fool and seeking re-election, I would definitely be screaming and calling President Hoover every name in the book, because his policies or his failures to address the Great Depression. I don't blame people for not being civil. Like, imagine if you lived in this country under George W. Bush, where he's sending your relatives off to a pointless war, or his policies have caused a huge recession and you've lost your job. I don't blame you for not only disapproving of the president, but speaking of him in the most crass, disrespectful ways possible. I mean, he was term limited, so there was little you could do to him, but you at least would know that he's not going to be in there much longer. But I would say it depends on the context of the situation. If you're a politician, I think you have to get thick skin and expect people to be like that towards you. Like if you're running because you look at Obama, people were calling him a monkey, an ape, saying he was born in Africa. That all these things, they're making all these birther conspiracy theories, saying he was the devil. And I will admit, it was pretty racist. Even as a little kid, I could tell it was pretty racist. But you'd have to develop thick skin to deal with that. I mean, you've had to develop thick skin to deal with like the kind of racist comments you get on your Curious Cat and your YouTube videos from Bearing fans. And speaking of race, I remember last year you made a video talking about race realism, and I didn't really know much about it until you made your video. And that was one of the few videos you've made where I was completely on board. Like, because I was listening to how you describe it and others just to make sure I'm getting not just one side of the or one version of the painting. And your picture of that topic was very similar, and I'm like, race realism. I think that their premise is flawed in general, and I think that I think that the term scientific racism is, maybe it's accurate, but I don't think it is scientific. I think it's pseudoscientific. And it sucks that this has to be said, that race realism is, like you said, Nazism in a fresh coat of paint. Because didn't you say it was something about? Actually, I'm going to let you kind of let you kind of explain your stance, because I know you believe that it's racist, and I agree with you, but to kind of articulate it better than I can.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, like you said, race realism is essentially just Nazism rebranded. It's eugenics that was debunked centuries ago. Maybe not centuries, but the turn of a century, 1900s. It was debunked back then. It's not got any basis in anything scientific, but because we live in an age where we've got a rising far right, sadly, we've got ideas about people which are essentially just rebranded Nazi ideas being reintroduced into public discourse. It's being adopted by a lot of people, people who can be convinced by some misappropriated or even falsified statistics, people who can be tricked into thinking that there's different races within humanity, and different like species even, just based on a few pictures. And when you take a closer look at the science behind it, you'll find there is none, or it's stuff that's been so completely distorted that it resembles it wouldn't be accepted in a proper scientific environment. And perhaps it's someone who is more used to having direct racism and who's been called a monkey and stuff before, and who's maybe faced a lot of the stuff that consists of racism, and thus is perhaps more adept at spotting it straight away. It becomes so obvious what this thing is, especially when we refer to mixed race people as mutts, and obviously a mutt is a dog which is crossbred. When it's literally like the same people advocating for race realism are saying these things, it becomes so obvious that there's it's essentially just rebranded eugenics. It's nothing scientific. I think the thumbnail for that video was race realism, and then the everything between the RAC in race and ISM in realism crossed out, so it's like race realism equals racism. But yeah, no, it is just utter trite, nothing substantial in it at all, and essentially a red flag, because it lets you know who is far right. Anyone who's advocating for that is quite blatantly racist and quite blatantly someone not worth listening to.
Yeah. Like when people point out instances of racism, like I always find it to be important that, like, if you get the full context of what they're saying, like usually you can spot whether it is racist or not. I remember you were pointing this out on your Twitter feed, which I would have been more surprised if you didn't catch wind of this, as you do scan the news a lot. The Florida gubernatorial election, the GOP nominee was calling the Democratic nominee, who is the first black man in the history of the state of Florida to be nominated by a major party for governor. He said that if this guy was elected, he would monkey it up. And I'm thinking at first, because I overheard it because my dad watches the news a lot, and I'm thinking, because I didn't know that the Democratic nominee was black. And like you mentioned about people that are mixed race get called mutts and whatnot, and black people get called monkeys. I'm like, okay, let's assume for a second he did not know the race of the Democratic nominee, or if the nominee was white or whatever. would he have just said, "Oh, if we elect this Democrat for governor, he's just going to ruin the economy. He's going to hurt the state of Florida," instead of just going to the monkey comment? Like when Voltaire debated Lapis, he used the term China people or Chinaman, which, if I'm not mistaken, that is widely viewed as a racist term.
Mm.
It's like, I'm pretty sure if race was, if the race of the person was unknown, or if it was of a different race, then the racial slur or term or dog whistle wouldn't have been used. You know, I think that when people are like, "Oh, black people in Africa have lower IQs," and when they say that, it's like because there's a few things that make that premise extremely flawed. Like, you got to look at the quality of education in various countries. Some are very great and very high, and some are very low. You remember when Donald Trump called certain African countries, and I say this with quotes, shitholes?
Yeah.
And when he mentioned that we should be taking in immigrants from Norway, which is a majority white country, and Africa is majority black, last I checked.
Yeah.
Yeah, honestly, because if you just took the shithole comment, it's crass, it's really uncalled for. I think you could say that it would depend on the intent, but when you add in the context of the Norway comment or the European countries comment, I would say that would make him racist. I mean, there's various things where it's like, I think you could argue Donald Trump is a racist, no doubt, in all honesty. But yeah, I think that race is a social construct. There's various people who would say things like the sun would actually affect skin color, like if you lived, on the southern hemisphere or south of the hemisphere, your skin color would be darker than those that are further north. Various things like that. I think that is a more realistic explanation of why our skin colors are different. And, I've never understood why some people have this huge aversion to mixed race people. I've met even black people who have a problem with mixed race people. And I've always seen it as silly. I've always seen it as just disrespectful. And I've always seen, like, when you told me you were mixed race, I had no reaction. I was like, oh, I didn't know that. I mean, I'm of mixed heritage. I wouldn't say race. I don't think Mexicans are a race, but more of an ethnicity, in all honesty.
So, what are you going to say? Is it quick or?
No, I was just I was gonna say you can go ahead and say what you need to say.
So a lot to go through. To remember. Firstly, the Florida governor situation. It's the phrase "monkey around" does just mean mess around. And lots of people said, "Oh, it just means that." But firstly, like you said, first black governor in the in Florida, but not even that, first candidate that's black in Florida against a Republican, and he just happens to say that. It's like, that's there's that. Then it's also Fox News, who quite regularly have dog whistles for white supremacist talking points. Literally refer to immigrants as the hordes, the swath, the
invaders,
whatever. Yeah, exactly. All those quite blatant dog whistles. And it's fairly obvious that if you're describing a black person as monkeying around, it's like, well, what's the connotation? What is fairly obvious? You don't live in a vacuum. The context, especially in America too, which in not that long ago, in the long run, had segregation. It's pretty clear that someone who is black shouldn't be referred to as a monkey, because if we're gonna assume this person isn't a stereotypical, oh, I'm in the clan racist, why would you say that if you wanted people to think you weren't like that? Moving on to what you said next, trying to think. IQ. Like you said, education in Africa, in general, obviously less resources can be allocated to it because the countries there don't have the same GDP and stuff. So subsequently, a lot of people either miss out or don't get a good quality education, and thus wouldn't do well on an IQ test. However, an IQ test is not, firstly, not a be all and end all of intelligence.
Of course.
Secondly, something which is, you can train someone to take an IQ test, and they might not have any applicable skills to the real world, but we'll ace that test on the IQ. Thirdly, it's not exactly something which is the measure of a society. Like, so what if people can take an IQ test? Is that really what you're going to say? Oh, this society is worth existing now because they scored 100 points, whatever, 150, 200 points on our test. It's a bit silly to rank a society like that. And there's a reason it's only really brought up by people who have the interest of portraying black people as, a subspecies or as worse off. If you're going to present the world as determined by these things, then why haven't you done that all across the board? The same people doing this ignore other categories which either have their supposed idealized culture coming out on the bottom, or black people on the top. It's nonsense, and it only comes up to degrade black people. Because they don't even look at it properly. They just lump it all together as Africa. Africa is not just the country of Africa, the people of Africa. It's a massive continent. It's the second biggest on the planet, with so many different cultures and nations and regions to it. So the complete lack of any anthropological nuance to it is revealing. I can't remember what else you said. You could remind me.
I'm having a bit of a mind blank. You actually kind of brought up a point I tried to articulate is, you look at the standard of the test, and you got to look at all the variables, and that's how you debunk race realism. Is you look at these various things where it's like, did you take this into account? Did you take this into account? And it's like, if you answered no, then either redo it or concede that it's flawed. But I cannot remember what else I had said. But I can't remember what else I had said. But I know I said something past that as well. But I don't know. I've just always. It was. I think I said something about the sun and where you lived on that planet, and the like certain parts of the planet, your skin would be darker due to the effects of the sun. That was generally what people would say to me quite a bit, as people would talk about race, if I remember correctly.
Well, people not taking into account variables.
Well, that was something you kind of hit the nail on the head with. Is something I should have mentioned when I first brought it up, the race realism thing. But it was the sun where you lived on the planet. The sun would affect your skin color depending where on the planet you lived.
Well, yeah, to a degree. I mean, the difference in environmental factors is obviously something that's going to affect all humans. But in the same way that we can look at the way height and hair and muscles and stuff, they all affect different things, and they're all different between humans. And you don't see these quote unquote race realists going after any of them. It's only ever along the lines of black people and white people, because they quite clearly know that if they were to spend any amount of time doing any sort of scientific research into this, that it would all fall apart. And the goal isn't science; it's racism. It's maintaining the hegemony of white people over black people. It's trying to lure more people into a racist mindset. And subsequently, it's why I'm of the opinion that with race realism and racism in general, really, you call it racist, you show it as racist as quickly as possible, and then you remove it from the conversation. You don't need to have a race realist present to discuss race realism. You expose it as the bogwash eugenics that it is, and discard it. And subsequently discard the people that are perpetuating the nonsense.
Yeah, and what you also said about Fox News and how they have white supremacists on. As sad as it is to say, I'm not surprised when they were calling immigrants invaders and whatnot. It's like, how in God's name can you expect someone to not say that's racist? Like, if I was to refer to people from Mexico like Donald Trump when he was saying they're rapists and whatnot. It's like, how can you expect people, and people who defend Trump say he was saying they're bringing their drugs, their crime, their rapists. Like, depending on how you use the word they or their, it's like, regardless, it's like, what, especially with the controversial issue of immigration and how people bring race into the matter. It's like, how, especially in times where racial sensitivity is, still a thing in society. How can you expect someone to not take that as racist? Like that's why I think if you're a politician or a very notable public figure, you should be extremely careful with how you phrase it. Like Riley Dennis, she's extremely careful with how she frames anything to try not get taken out of context, and I can't blame her. And I mean, of course, at some point you just have to say this is how I frame it, and if you're going to straw man it, then I can't help you if that's how you're going to be. But yeah, in general with Fox News and whatnot and people like that, I always find them to be the biggest hypocrites on things like that. Like there was this Republican congressman in Ohio who was very anti-LGBT, resigned from office because he was caught having sex with a man in his office. And I always found it to be so interesting, like these very socially conservative and maybe even far-right individuals in public office. Like there was a state representative in my state who was in favor of cracking down on prostitution, resigns from office after getting caught soliciting a prostitute. Alex Jones, who's very outspoken against trans rights, was caught fetishizing trans women when they somehow caught trans pornography on his phone. I saw Lapis retweet that, and it didn't shock me that Alex Jones, the horrible person he is, was to be doing something like that. That's the type of thing with these news outlets. And something that you kind of just reminded me of, you look at news outlets back in the 70s, for instance, to today, there was far fewer. You and I would have had to have gotten our news sources. Well, if you lived in the same country that I live in, you would have to rely on very few sources. Now, the demand for conservative media and liberal and whatever, there's a demand and it's being supplied, and sadly, the supply is being delivered by some very horrible, very atrocious news sites like Fox News. And it's a shame that people even take Fox News seriously. But so, out of curiosity, have you ever been to the United States?
No, I've never even left Europe. So, I mean, I would want to go, but at the same time, firstly because of the way things are at the moment, and secondly because not too fond of the police in the US, I would probably halt on going. But at the same time, it's I've not been, but it's a very interesting country to look at, and the geography, the natural scenery and stuff is pretty amazing. So
yeah, I've been up to Montana and Wyoming to see the Yellowstone National Park. It is very beautiful. Yeah, the United States is an interesting country. The United Kingdom's fascinating, especially for their electoral systems, which sound overcomplicated, honestly. And same with Lapis's country. I've never left the United States. I've been in the north, in the south, in the Midwest, and the West. Never in the Northeast. But the reason I ask is because you would talk about your criticisms of the United States government on things like economics, foreign policy, gerrymandering, which I actually found out where the word came from, and it's kind of embarrassing if that's your legacy. But yeah, seeing those type of things, seeing that you'd mentioned racism in your country, while of course racism is bad, you would always point out that the United States racism is far worse. With and I have to agree. I remember when Black Lives Matter came out in 2013, but they got really widespread in 2014. I would have definitely been a full-fledged supporter of them. People, I have to agree with you and Lapis. I hate those. Well, I wouldn't say hate, but I just laugh at those who are like, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 cured racism. Like, no, it didn't. But it was a start to change things. and you know, racial tensions have gotten worse. I don't agree with War Corps that Obama divided the country, and even if that was true, that's not his fault. Like, if I was Obama, I wouldn't feel bad at all for being the first black president. I think it's a shame some people only like him because of that, or that's what he'll be remembered for. I've always thought that is a shame. Like, let's say you were elected as the first. I don't know if you have ever had a black prime minister, but let's say you were the first. I would say it would be a shame that they would only remember you for that. Like, same with when people are like, if Hillary Clinton would be elected president, which, in all honesty, forced between the two, I would have voted for Hillary Clinton in all honesty, but nonetheless, the whole first female, it didn't matter to me. You shouldn't care if this person is whatever. You should care that they're going to fix the problems that you need fixed. Or that should be the general consensus.
Yeah, like in an ideal world, we would just vote based on the ideals of the person, and sort of things like race, gender, sexuality, they wouldn't come into effect. And obviously, sadly, in our society today, we still have those lines of marginalization. When like you say, the situation of racism in the two countries we live in is vastly different. We never had legalized segregation. We never had the apartheid, in essence, that was seen in America, and subsequently our country has been far less racially divided than in America. And that isn't to say racism isn't a problem here. We still have police brutality, we still have higher rates of policing, and we still definitely have the classism and hegemony that exists. You only have to look at certain outlets in our media which do a good job of still maintaining the racial prejudice that exists in our country. Maybe not as overtly as in the US, but it's still there. But the US is obviously a different kettle of fish, and it's a lot worse over there. There's a reason Fox News can literally broadcast on the stuff they do, and people will come out in droves to say it. People literally won't accept someone's racist unless they're caught saying the N-word or something, and even then they'll still come up with lots of caveats as to why they won't be considered racist.
Yeah.
And it's sad, because all that should be needed really to overturn and change said racism is just a few people standing up to it, and sort of making it clear that said ideas won't be be
accepted.
Exactly accepted. Had a mind blank there.
It's all right. You're only human, and we all have mind blanks.
Exactly. And speaking of which, my mind's actually getting a little bit tired. So if in 15 minutes we could sort of draw this to a conclusion.
Yeah, I'm having an agreement there. I mean, like I mentioned, I've been up since 3 a.m., so I'll probably end that in 10-15 minutes. But yeah, no worries.
With racism, it's important to break down, not just because it's obviously an awful wrong thing, but it has a real effect. The ideas of racism and indeed of any social injustice or bigotry have an effect on the well-being and lives of people who the bigotry is aimed at. So the racism of the average person towards another person is a knock-on on top of the systemic problems that exist in society. The ideas that black people are inferior are accumulated and combine into systemic poverty, mass incarceration, heavier policing, prison labor, all those things which are problems in our society. And that's why it's so important to, on the very basic person-to-person level, break down some of his racism and thus stand up to it when we see it and stuff.
Yeah, a good example of and I remember you didn't get directly involved, but you did oversee a lot of this because this is when around the time me and Lapis met, when Voltaire kind of outed himself as kind of having some fascist sympathies when he was defending Pinochet, and you and Ham were going after him about that, saying, "Are you out of your mind?" When he was saying that women shouldn't have the right to vote, and as soon as he mentioned that it was okay to hate LGBT culture, you heard, or at least I think I told you, or somebody told you that, we went off on him like you just like at the flip of a light switch, everyone organized against him and was saying, like, grilling him about this. I mean, like, without mercy, just grilling, demanding to understand why he's saying something like this, and then he just left the chat. Yeah, I think that, like, if someone's, or it doesn't even, to me, it doesn't necessarily take bigotry to call somebody out. Like, if let's say you were annoying me, or let's say you were spamming me, or let's say you were just doing something where it's like you're misbehaving, or you're doing. I mean, to be fair, that's subjective. But let's say you're doing something, like, you wouldn't have to say, like, the N word or whatever. Like, if you're just doing something that I might find unethical or to be wrong, I'll call you out, or I wouldn't say publicly. I don't like the habit of left Twitter to do these public call outs. I would more or less, like, if Owen was to say something really backwards about mental health, I'd pull him aside and say, do you understand why I would have a problem with you saying that? Or I'd say, yeah, I don't agree with that, and here's the problem here. But yeah, in general, I think that in terms of how people act, like, people on here would of course say it's just words like chair, although he would not understand the nuance of, like, let's say I was dropping, like, anti-Semitic language a lot. Like, people could say, well, do you act like that in real life? Let's say I was spamming feminists on Twitter, calling them bitch and telling them to make me a sandwich. People could be like, do you act like that in real life? Warcorp says he doesn't act like that in real life, and I believe him, although in all honesty I wouldn't be shocked if he didn't, if he was lying there. But yeah, I think I will actually just wrap it up right here. But thank you for joining me for this. If you ever want to interview me or want me to ask any other questions, you can let me know via DMs.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. It's not often you get the request to be interviewed, so yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah. All right. So when I repost this to my main channel so people can see it, I'll leave a link to your channel, your Twitter, and whatnot. And if you want me to add anything else, you can just let me know. Thank you to everyone who watched, and have a good night, everybody, and until next time.